One of the most impactful scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring is when Frodo is confronted by the Nazgul at Weathertop. This is primarily because we finally get to see what the Ringwraiths truly look like after Frodo slips on the ring. The dishevelled, ghostly wraiths, a vicious mockery of their former powerful selves. It gives the viewer an insight into the spiritual realm that is woven through Tolkien's Legendarium and that we don't get to see. In the Two Towers film, we look like we're about to be treated to another venture into the spiritual realm, when Frodo is tempted to slip on the ring in Osgiliath. This time, the Ringwraith that is confronting him is atop a massive fellbeast. I for one was very excited to see what a fellbeast would look like within this spiritual realm, until Sam comes and spoils the party. That inspired me about 5 years ago to make a Twilight Ringwraith on fellbeast conversion. You can see it here in this stunningly clear 480p. It looks like it was filmed on a potato. I felt that the Twilight Ringwraith aesthetic would fit really nicely into my Angmar army, and so I kind of adapted a green ghostly look. Although it's not particularly reminiscent of the films, it did fit with the aesthetic of my Angmar army at the time. If you would like to watch that video, it's very old now, but it is linked in the cards above. In the new edition of MESBG, however, it doesn't appear that Angmar can take a fellbeast. So I decided to, in the spirit of the new edition, update this conversion by correcting some of the aspects of it I don't like, the tail and the legs for example, so I could play it in the Wraiths on Wings army list. I'm Joe from Windrift Wargamers, and here I am rescuing my Twilight Ringwraith on fellbeast conversion. So let's perform an autopsy on this conversion and see what parts I like and what parts I don't like. Even in the Angmar showcase video, I did express I didn't quite like the tail. The look I was going for at the time was a particularly long and imposing winding tail that looks like a kind of serpent or something. I did this by taking several spare tails and cutting them up and placing them together to elongate it, but frankly it just looks terrible. It doesn't look like one piece, it doesn't look like a natural tail at all. Secondly, let's look at the legs. The sculpting on the legs leaves an awful lot to be desired. This was particularly tricky because it's load bearing. I wasn't using a flying stand like before, so they were carrying the whole weight of the Wraith and the fellbeast to make it perch on top of the ruined wall. They were sort of pinned in place with a very long piece of paper clip, and I just sculpted some terrible looking legs around it, but ultimately they're way too stiff and they don't look natural. Almost looks like he has stilts or something. I think the rider for the most part looks okay, so I'm not going to be changing much about that conversion. It's just a simple head swap from the Twilight Ringwraith onto the body of the Ringwraith atop the fellbeast. Lastly, the terrain. It kind of goes without speaking that I would have to change the terrain slightly to make it fit more with the southern aesthetic. The northern Arnorian Angmar aesthetic, the cold, frosty, icy ruins that I was going for, would no longer really apply for Osgiliath, say, or Ithilien. So with all that in mind, I set about removing the parts that I wasn't so keen on. Due to years of being kept in, a cardboard box, it started to break apart. So I merely gave it a nudge in the right direction by removing it from the ruins, ripping off the legs, taking apart the wings. With the piece broken down into its separate components, I could begin actually fixing them up. I started with the biggest, most imposing pieces, which are probably the wings. In the army showcase, I take great delight in informing the viewers that these wings are from the Balrog kit and not the fellbeast kit. In the end, I did the old switcheroo and made a Balrog based upon this artwork, linked in the cards above if you want to see that. But for right now, I wanted to make this look even more distinct and fall into that kind of ghostly nature of the spirit realm. I decided that I wanted to remove the membrane in between the spines of the wing. This would lean into that grotesque nature, give it an otherworldly feel. I snipped away with some clippers, but in the end I did end up breaking out the Dremel tool as it just became way too tough to get through. It left them very rough, but I was able to clean them up with a hobby knife. Now this is probably the best one. The other one sustained a lot of damage, but I was able to fix that later on, which you'll see. With the wings suitably ghostly, I could move on to the legs and the tail. Now there was one central problem with removing the legs. Obviously I would need a new place for it to stand. I ruminated on this for quite a while, but in the end a bolt of luck hit me. I bought a seconds box, so misprinted 3D prints, and in them was this wonderful Fellbeast-like tail. It was connected to the rock, and it was very, very sturdy. This would have been perfect. This kills two birds with one stone. It meant that I could fix the tail, which was an absolute abomination. I would have had to proxy that in some way anyway, because there was no saving that tail. And also, it would take the pressure off resculpting the legs. This was because they would no longer be load bearing and they could just swing freely. Now I'm kicking myself right now because I appear to have lost most of the footage of me sculpting. It's really annoying because I'm actually quite proud of how it turned out. I'll give a quick overview of how I did it and where I did it, and then hopefully you can just see it in the final piece. I also can't show you me putting it back together because that's also lost. I do fortunately have the footage from the painting, so I can at least show you that. I wanted to move away from the green ghostly appearance of my Angmar army, so I looked for inspiration. I didn't just want to do the white and black overexposed look of the films, I wanted a little bit more colour. The way that Games Workshop had painted their Twilight Ringwraith was this kind of blue-grey robe, very pale features. I quite liked it. I was going to steal from that. I started with a mid-grey, covering the whole robes. This was then washed down with Griffcharger Grey, which is a blue-grey. It looks really nice over this. I was using a Twilight Ringwraith on foot just to try out the scheme, and also he can work as the dismount for this piece. When the Griffcharger Grey was dry, I sketched in some highlights using a lighter grey, almost an off-white, with the flat of my brush. This looks quite extreme here, it does dull down slightly. After that I applied a few thin coats of white to the hair. When the white was dry and I was happy with the coverage, I washed it down with some Apothecary White. This sat in the recesses and gave some very light grey shadows, which highlighted the strands of hair nicely. One aspect from the films that I did want to replicate was the black eyes. This was simply done by going into the eye sockets with some black. The greeny skin was okay, but it was a bit scratchy from where I dry brushed it 5 years ago, so I decided to smooth out the skin with some very light blue. I did two highlights, getting progressively lighter, more towards white, until it was basically an off-white blue. Sorry it's out of focus here, but that is what's happening. Just to add a little bit of contrast to the crown, I did add a few kind of brassy, bronzy, coppery tones to it. I liked where this piece was going, but I really wanted to make it a little bit more ghostly. I applied a few thin coats of white just to from the bottom of the legs. I was then able to tint it with a glaze of very thin down Talisar blue contrast paint. This was a gradient of blue going up the model until fading into grey, and I was able to finish it off with some highlights of pure white. With the rider done, I could avert my attention to the base. The Ringwraith on Fellbeast sits on a 60mm base, and I wanted it to be from his point of view. So everything on that base is how he sees the world, through his eyes, which we only get a glimpse in the films when a ring bearer puts on the ring. When Bilbo slips on the ring in the ruins of Dale, in the Battle of the Five Armies, we get to see elves and the survivors of Lake Town have white spiritual ghosts, whereas the Gundabad orcs have black shadowy ghosts. This is something I wanted to replicate, but of course within the Ithilien theatre of war. So I, like many of you, have lots of spare Rangers of Gondor, and also some Morannon orcs as well. The Ranger of Gondor was painted white. It was washed down with some Nighthawk Gloom contrast paint, and then highlighted back up to white. Whereas the Morannon Orc foe was primed black, was highlighted up to some grey, and then washed back down with a glaze of some thinned black contrast paint. To anchor them to the piece, and to unify them with the rider to make it look like they're in the same sort of spiritual realm, I did the same white and Talisar blue contrast paint trick with their legs. For the rest of the base, I wanted it quite monotone. It was just a brown, which was washed down with this Coelia green shade, which is a kind of bluey green. This gives another worldly kind of figure, but also it dumbs down the brown. It was highlighted with some Mornfang brown, and there's some dead tufts. This would make it look like a kind of barren wasteland, but also, more importantly, wouldn't distract from the very loud, ghostly figures on the base. The last bridge I had to cross was how was I going to paint the Fellbeast. In the end, I decided to paint it a kind of black, just like the orc, so that it would be visually in keeping with the style and also make sense from a narrative perspective. These are our creatures that have been corrupted by dark forces, be it Sauron or Morgoth, so I painted it black, much like I did with the orc, but the extremities and the mouth were that kind of glowing blue. This served to highlight all the dangerous bits of the Fellbeast, and also the black meant it didn't distract too much from the rider, so he stood out a little bit. With everything painted, I could glue it all down, and I was left with this. So what do you think of the overall piece? I quite like it. I think it's a big improvement on where I was. I'm much happier to put this on the table now, and I'm excited to try out that new army list. I'm annoyed at myself for misplacing that footage. The sculpting process wasn't that complicated, but it was quite effective in my opinion. I just padded out the basic shape with tin foil, and then sculpted over it with some putty, and then smoothed out the sculpt so you can no longer see all my fingerprints like you did before with some sprue goo. The sprue goo was then smoothed down with some plastic glue with a brush. This gave a really smooth effect. But let me know what you think about this guy in the comments below. Let me know if you think the composition works, if you think it makes narrative sense for it to be this way. Let me know if you've made one as well. Make sure you subscribe for more videos. I've got loads of stuff in the pipeline that I'm working on, especially with the new edition. I've got to upgrade a lot of my armies that are no longer legal or have profiles that have been dismissed, so there'll be a lot of change, a lot of flux, and you'll be able to see a lot of the projects I'm working on. So make sure you subscribe and hit the bell notification for that. Equally, if you wanted to catch everything I work on, not even just the stuff that I make videos about, you can join the Discord. It's absolutely free. There's loads of good hobbyists in there now. It's a really great community. We give each other tips and support and inspiration. It's a really great place to be, so check the link below for that. I've been Joe from We're Just Wargamers. Thank you so much for stopping in with me. With any luck, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.